We are live.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Freeman, Matt at the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. Welcome to the June 11th, 2017 NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Giffen, an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a three-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. You can follow him on Twitter at RotoDoc. Nick, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Matt. I got all my lineups done.
Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Freeman.
I got all my lineups done last night. Sorry, I had the stream playing in the background in my ear set. I was
amateur.
I know, amateur move there. I'm doing great. I got all my lineups done last night, so I'm pretty excited. Normally, even in this last hour after the show, there's a couple that I'm usually doing, tweaking, cash game, whatever. But 100% done, so I'm ready to just help everybody else out.
What does your hat say? Menards?
Yeah, it's the Paul Menard hat right there. So I think there you can see the 27.
Yeah.
It's backward, obviously, with the webcam, but yep.
Yeah. All right. So before we get into the Twitter questions, a few things to talk about. One, we have Martin Truex Jr. and then Dale Jr. going to the back of the field post-qualifying. Talk about that.
Yeah, so they both went to the back. So Martin Truex Jr. qualified second. Dale Earnhardt Jr. qualified 28th. And both of them go to the rear of the field for engine changes. Little different reasons. Dale Earnhardt Jr. basically nuked his engine. He was in third gear, trying to shift to fourth. He accidentally shifted down to second and just kablamo. So Dale Jr. kind of misshifted there, and those are things that can happen at Pocono. Pocono is one of the possibly the only oval track where we get some regular shifting, and then obviously we should do a lot of shifting at the road courses. But so Dale Jr. nuked his engine there, and then Martin Truex Jr. after qualifying for whatever reason they had to make an engine change. Didn't see exactly why. He didn't obviously nuke it, but they must have found something they didn't like, and so they changed the engine as well. So the implications of that are actually pretty big for Truex because, I mean, he was probably mostly a fade anyway, given the fact that he qualified second. He wasn't super fast in final practice. Pocono is still a very good track for him, so I would have had maybe up to like 10% exposure, although for me personally, I probably would have faded him 100% anyway, simply because I think if I'm going to just play him 10%, it's very unlikely of all of my lineups, one of the ones of the 10% that he's in, it's going to win. So I think I'm just going to full leverage and fade him. Well, now he's basically a complete fade, starting second, but by qualifying position, but starting dead last in terms of starting position. So he's very unlikely he's going to get dominator points. I will say there's one scenario that I can see where he, it's plausible that he ends up in the winning lineup, and that's if we get maybe like an early caution, and either he stays out when the rest of the field comes in, or he comes in if the rest of the field stays out, and then later under green, the rest of the field pits and he gets out front. So, kind of does the opposite of what all the leaders do and the rest of the field does. I think there's like that one plausible scenario where he kind of gets off strategy to get up front and dominates a portion of the race that way. So I think, there's probably a 3 to 5% chance he's in the winning lineup, I think. So it's really your call on how you want to play Truex. He's the most expensive driver this weekend, and he's almost surely going to need more than just a handful of fastest laps, as most people get during the race. A lot of drivers will get fastest laps, but he's probably going to need more than just a handful of fastest laps. He'll probably need to dominate, 40, 50 laps as well, at least, and then finish in the top 5 or so. So pretty tall task for him there. So he's mostly a complete fade. I can understand if you want to be contrarian and think, well, everybody's going to fade him now. If you think he's going to go under-owned, then play him. But I'll probably just be, I already have set my lineups. I am completely fading him.
Okay, so I think there are some interesting things to go off of this, but is he a bigger fade in part because there are just fewer laps? So even if he somehow does dominate, it doesn't even kind of mean as much?
Yeah, so there's only 160 laps, and so, obviously the maximum he could lead is 160, which would be 40 points. So there's only 40 points available for laps led. That's not many, obviously, and so he's not going to lead all 160 laps. He's probably not even going to lead half of them, given the fact that he's starting way back there. So you're really looking at probably, if he does air quote dominate, probably only 20% of the race, 25% of the race. So let's say it's 25% of the race. That's 40 laps led. That's only 10 DraftKings points.
Right.
So, if he loses 5 positions from his starting spot, if he finishes 7th, that negates those 10 points. He's not worth being in the winning lineup, or he's not worth playing because he won't be in the winning lineup. So, in that case, he's going to need to finish top 3 if he even leads 25% of the race. So he's probably going to need to lead more than 25% of the race and finish top 3 to be in the winning lineup. It's a very, very tall order for him.
So my second question on this is, how does the engine play into it? So I would kind of assume that if they're swapping in another engine, or at least swapping out engine parts, whatever it is, that it's not, at least they haven't optimized it yet in a way that they maybe could have if they were practicing with that engine. How does the engine impact your thoughts on this?
It actually has basically zero impact.
Okay.
So they build these engines to really specific specs, and you don't tweak the engine much once, if any, once the weekend starts. So, they get great engines over there at Toyota, I think from Toyota Racing Development, TRD, and so I'm sure everything's going to be fine with the engine. Now, if it was like one of these medium-sized teams and instead of an engine, it was a car, they wrecked the car and had to go to a backup car, you might say, well, it's the backup car, so it's probably not as good as their primary car. And I think that's true for some of the medium or smaller teams. But with the big teams, even if you go to a backup car in the big teams, their second car is going to be, if not as good as the first one, just a hair under. So, and then we're not even talking cars, we're talking engines here. So I think there's zero worries there. Same with Dale Jr., no worries about the engine. And I should mention about Dale Jr., you can play him as normal. He qualified 28th and he starts 40th, but that's pretty much negligible because he'll probably pass all of those guys and get back into 28th within the first couple laps. So just think of him as playing him like you would normally.
Okay. And then a final question. You mentioned their Toyota. So one thing that, is pretty notable. Last week, you had Kyle Busch starting first, Truex second. You had Kenseth starting fourth. This week, you have Kyle Busch again at the pole. Truex qualified second, and then you have Kenseth qualifying third. Is there something with the Toyotas, like some sort of edge? I mean, I know qualifying is different than practicing, but at least some sort of edge that they seem to have in terms of even just qualifying.
I think as of right now, it definitely looks like they do. I would certainly say Toyota has a qualifying edge these days. So if you're playing a format like Yahoo, where you get points for qualifying in the top 3, that's something to think about. And it could translate to the race as well at a track like Pocono, where this horsepower means a lot because we have such long straightaways. So, that said, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, we're all non-Toyotas. So it's not like they're at a supreme advantage, maybe just a mild advantage over the rest of the field. And it definitely could just be a JGR thing. They could just be, obviously Truex being an affiliate of JGR there over at Furniture Row. Maybe they found something setup-wise as well. But, I wouldn't necessarily say so much there's a Toyota advantage this week, given that 4th through 8th was all non-Toyotas.
All right, that's fair. Okay, so we're going to get to the Twitter questions very soon. Before that, I just want to remind everyone that you can get the 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass. If you're doing it on a week-by-week basis, maybe think about extending it out for the rest of the season. I think you probably save money that way. But anyway, think about doing the 30% discount to the NASCAR pass. Also, if you want more NASCAR insight from RotoDoc, you can check out a video course that he has at Roto Academy with JM DeWin of Roto Grinders. That, of course, is at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Okay, Nick, let's talk about Pocono. And, the first question that we had, obviously, was someone asking, do you just fade Martin Truex Jr. outright? So I think just for the rest of the show, we can just say you are fading him. But can you make the case, and you've already kind of done this a little bit, but make the contrarian case for why someone would want to, like why would someone want to be heavier on Truex Jr. than the field is going to be?
Yeah, it's definitely a contrarian case, and you're banking on him being at like 5%, 10% ownership and going 15 to 20% on him and just getting a little leverage on the field, maybe 20% ownership to get enough leverage. And you're banking on the rest of the field being like 10% on him. I still think even in the beast, the $8 beast, Truex will probably be over 10% owned just because there's a lot of casual players who play, a lot of people who could just for whatever reason miss the news about Truex going to the back. And there's still some people who I think will take the contrarian approach. So I think he will be probably between, I would say, like 8 and 15% owned would be my guess. And I still think that's going to be too high. So, you can go overweight on him if you want, 20, 25% in that range. I just think that's a very unlikely scenario. That is a high risk maneuver you're doing there. Now, it's obviously got a huge payoff as well if he hits, but I think it's very unlikely. I think the probability that he's in the winning lineup is in that 3 to 5% range, just because you need dominator points when you're that expensive, and it's just going to be very hard for him to get those. I would pin his dominator chances, so not just leading a couple laps, but actually, maybe getting at least 20 dominator points total between fastest laps and laps led. I would pin that probably, like I said, around a 3 to 5% chance, maybe a little higher, maybe like a 6 or 7% chance. And then he still also has to end up finishing inside the top 3 or 5 if he does get more than 20 dominator points.
Okay, so I have a question. So normally you talk about sort of like inside grooves and outside grooves and preferred grooves and stuff like this. So Truex was starting second. How does that impact where people start in terms of like where they move up and stuff?
That's a great question. So technically, Kyle Busch gets to pick whichever line he wants, either the inside line or the outside line. And then as they kind of do their pace laps, Truex will line up in second, and then he'll peel off and drop to the back of the field. So whichever line Truex is in, everybody will move forward, and that depends on the line that Kyle Busch chooses. He can either choose the inside line or the outside line for that first restart. So either Matt Kenseth or Ryan Blaney will move up into that front row, depending on which line Kyle Busch chooses. So Kyle Busch obviously is going to choose the preferred groove, which I think tends to be the outside on Pocono restarts, but it really is just an advantage to Kyle Busch either way, because he gets to be the one who hits the hammer first, get the gas down first, because he controls the restart. So not only does he have the preferred groove, he also has the advantage of actually being the first guy to hit the gas, because other drivers cannot pass him before the start-finish line. So Kyle Busch almost certainly will lead the first laps, especially if it's Kenseth. What I think will happen is he'll probably choose it so that Kenseth moves up into the front row with him, and they'll work together to get them 1-2 after the opening lap. That would be my best guess as to what they do. So I'm pretty confident Kyle Busch will lead those early laps.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes sense there. What does that mean for how you might approach Kenseth and Blaney?
Yeah, I think it's tough still, because it's hard playing drivers that are in the top 3, 5 positions, starting positions at Pocono, just because there aren't a ton of laps available to dominate and lead. So really the only way you're playing, Kenseth is if he, again, leads a handful of laps and finishes in the top 5. That's the only way he can be in the winning lineup. Now, he's 9,000, whereas Truex is 10,300. So it's a little bit higher probability that Kenseth's in the winning lineup, because there's some salary relief involved with him relative to Truex. But he's still going to have to get out in front of his teammate, and I don't think he has the speed to do that. I think, he showed qualifying speed. He didn't necessarily show speed in practice. And then Blaney was even slower in practice. I think it's pretty unlikely that either of them end up dominating the race outside of, I should say, at the opening restart. I think maybe with pit stops, if we get a caution and they are somehow able to leapfrog Kyle Busch, if they are, they retain their position second or third on the track and then leapfrog Kyle Busch in the pits, maybe under a caution, then there's a chance when they control the restart that they could dominate a portion of the race. But I still think with the segments being, 50 laps and then 50 laps, we're going to see a lot of mix, and then different fuel strategies. We're going to see a lot of mixing up of dominators, of lap leaders. So I think it's going to be very tough to play anybody starting inside the top 5, even Kyle Busch. I don't think you should have a super high exposure to him, because the field will definitely shake up, I think, throughout the race.
Okay, so you just mentioned people in the top 5. Let's talk about number 5, Kurt Busch, and we actually have 2 back-to-back questions on him. Nice. from different people. So one person is saying, what are your thoughts on Kurt Busch? He looks like a sneaky dominator. The other guy is saying, the model seems to dislike Kurt Busch. Why are some people high on him, and why is his projected ownership high?
Yeah, so one of the terms in my model is picks, tout picks, and Stevie picked Kurt Busch, and that has a heavy influence on his ownership percentage. So he picked him in GPPs. So That is a reason for the inflated ownership projection there. I don't mind Kurt Busch at all. I do have some exposure to him. I'm going to be underweight relative to the projected ownership of about 20% projected ownership. So I think my model says, 20.4% projected ownership. I'm going to be underweight on Kurt, but I still have exposure to him because there definitely is a chance he could dominate a portion of this race from that 5th starting position. This is a good track for him. He won here last year. He's shown a lot of speed in the past couple weeks. He was right up there fighting for the lead last week at Dover when he just got a little too loose on a restart, spun out and hit Brad Keselowski, and they both wrecked out of the race. But Kurt Busch, I think, is found his groove with that team right now and looks really strong. If anybody inside the top 5 starting positions dominates other than Kyle Busch, my best guess is it'll be Kurt Busch and not Ryan Blaney or Matt Kenseth. So of the drivers in the top 5 I have exposure to, Kyle Busch and Kurt Busch will be the ones I pretty much strictly use. I'm not going to use Truex at all. And then Kenseth and Blaney, I have between 0 and 5% as well.
Mm-hmm. So there is a bullish case to be made for Kurt Busch, but you probably will still be underweight on him.
Yeah, I'll probably be underweight just because it's still tough to play drivers in that top 5 at Pocono. Obviously, it can be done. There have been drivers that start on the top 5 that have been in the winning lineup, but it's usually on average about 1 per race. So you just, it's actually less than 1 per race. So I think the main thing is I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to drivers inside that top 5 because percentages say that the winning lineup is not going to have somebody in that top 5.
All right, there's a question here. Stevie has number 48 in the fade category. Can you touch on this? And just for everyone out there, number 48, I believe, is Jimmie Johnson.
Man, look at you go there, Matt.
You know how I remember that?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Jimmie Johnson, same name as the Dallas Cowboys coach, and number 48 was Daryl Johnson's number, Moose fullback for the Cowboys back in the day. So word association.
Making the NFL connection. Love
exactly, it.
Exactly, yeah. So actually, I had to clarify something about Stevie's fade of Jimmie Johnson. That was before qualifying, so he makes a video before qualifying, and he said Jimmie was in a void before qualifying. Then qualifying happened, and Jimmie qualified 19th. So if you read his updated article, he says Jimmie's fine in both cash games and GPPs. So I think we just need to make sure we clear the record straight on that he doesn't think Jimmie Johnson is a fade. He thinks he's a good play. So I'm not sure how to answer the rest of that question.
There you go. I think you did a good job. Okay, so someone's asking about flat tracks. Is flat track racing the main reason that most people are looking for a single dominator this week? And is there an optimal contrarian build?
So it's not flat track itself. It's just the fact that there's only 160 laps. That's not a ton of laps. And then you also get the fact that we have things at Pocono like fuel strategy. We can have some pretty big wrecks. If you get 3 wide in a turn 1 and somebody wipes out, you can take 3, 4, 5 cars out in a single wreck. Those are the reasons that we are looking for most likely a single dominator, some 2 dominator lineups. Certainly, I definitely have some lineups with 2 dominators, and I think I even have a couple 0 dominator lineups, just banking on the fact that laps led will be completely spread out, and so I'm not really counting on anybody to be a dominator. So it's not because it's a flat track. Now, flat tracks do tend to help make it harder to pass because tends to be a single preferred groove. But at Pocono, it's probably the least of all of the flat tracks where this is the case because turn 1 is so wide. There's some banking in it. Turn 2 is the tunnel turn, which is the hard one. That's where there's basically only a single groove. And then turn 3, you can also kind of make some passes. And you can pass at Pocono. If you get off the corner really well, the straightaway is so long that if you get off the corner better than the guy in front of you, you're going to have a faster speed on the whole straightaway. And this straightaway is more than a half mile long, especially the main 2 straightaways. So you can definitely make some passes at Pocono. So it's not because it's a flat track. It's just because there's only 160 laps led. It means only 40 lap led points total. Compare that to a 400 lap race where there's 100 lap led points total. And you can really see the difference. And then the same thing with the fastest laps. They tend to correlate with the laps led. Not perfectly, obviously, but those guys that tend to be fast will rack up a ton of fastest laps, and you won't get that as much at Pocono with only 40 laps led points and only 80 fastest laps points.
So it has more to do with the length of Pocono as opposed to the fact that it's flat.
The length, and I think the fact that we'll see a lot of differing strategies. So definitely.
Okay. So someone's asking about GPP strategy for some of the drivers starting later. So Chase Elliott, 25, Casey Kane, 26, Dale Jr., 28, but, kind of at the back. But anyway, so those three guys, what is the GPP strategy? Is it too contrarian to fade them?
So Dale, Casey, and Chase. Yeah, I think you don't want to. I don't think you want to fade any of them completely, obviously. I think you can go underweight on one or possibly even two of them if that's the route you want to take, because it's unlikely that all three will be in the winning lineup. So I certainly can understand being underweight on one or two of them. And I think that's a perfectly valid strategy. I think that's a totally fine strategy. So, I think you just got to pick one. You just got to pick one or two and go underweight on one or two of them and hope it's the right one. Alternatively, you can do the GTO approach and just be about equal weight to the field. And I think in terms of my model projections, I've got Chase Elliott projected about 53%, Casey Kane about 43%, and Dale Jr. about 42.5%. I also think those are pretty close to the probabilities each of those ends up in the winning lineup. So I think this is going to be a week where if you just want to go air quote GTO and not actually leverage on those drivers and try to be contrarian elsewhere, that's a valid approach as well. So really depends on what you want to do. Obviously, if you fade any of those, it's a higher risk strategy because there is a decent chance that there's a decent chance individually that they all end up in the winning lineup. Not they all together, but individually, any one of them ends up in the winning lineup. The problem is when you take 50% times 40% times 40%, all of a sudden you're only talking about like an 8% chance that all three of them are in the winning lineup together. So, I think it really just comes down to a strategic decision that you make. Who do you want to fade? I personally like fading Dale Earnhardt Jr. He wasn't the fastest of the three in the practice session, and he was uncomfortable with his car at the beginning of practice. He said they made a lot of improvements towards the end of practice. It was also a very good track for him. So I think being a little bit underweight on Dale Earnhardt Jr. makes a lot of sense, and that's the route I'm going to go this week.
Okay, so you've already said that relatively you're going to be a little underweight on the top five, or there's reason to be pessimistic about drivers in the top five. How does fuel mileage strategy play into that? Is there a reason to think that because of fuel mileage strategy, maybe one of the guys in the top five could dominate more than you think he will?
Yeah, definitely. There's always a chance for Kyle Busch to just get out front, no caution in the first segment, and he leads, let's say 40 or 45 of those 50 laps because we will have pit stops during that first segment if it goes green because the fuel window is only 35 laps. But if there's like a 5-lap overlap where he's pitted and somebody else stays out, for example, that's possible. And then, like we said, maybe it comes down to the end of the race and Kurt Busch decides to try to stretch it all the way to the end while everybody else is coming in pit. Then yeah, he could lead 30, 40 laps if he stretches it. That's definitely a possibility as well. We almost saw that yesterday in the Xfinity race. I think it was Justin Allgaier was leading for a while. It was either Allgaier or another driver, but Keslowski was the dominant driver on speed. But towards the end of the race there, I think it was Allgaier and Brendan Gaughan stayed out and had like a huge lead over Keslowski, who was 40 seconds back because he had pitted. And so had a caution not come out, they were going to try to stretch it all the way to the end or as long as they could. And that meant one of those two drivers, I think it was Allgaier who's leading out front, would have racked up 30, 40 laps led. That's certainly possible. But again, that said, that could be any driver. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in the top five. Right. So, like I said, with drivers in the top five, you're just hoping that they do end up dominating a portion of the race and also still end up finishing in the top five or so, depending on their actual starting position.
Mm-hmm. All right, a question about Bowyer versus Dale Jr. in cash.
I think this is a really interesting question because we talked about Dale Jr., Casey Kane, and Chase Elliott on the podcast earlier this week and how I was going to make 3 cash game lineups, and I was definitely not going to have all 3 of them in all 3 cash lineups. As it turns out, I'm only using Dale Earnhardt Jr. in one of my 3, and that's just because I found some other cash game constructions I like. Now, is it Clint Bowyer? It actually turns out, no, I'm not even using Clint Bowyer in cash, but I think an argument can definitely be made for using Clint Bowyer over Dale Earnhardt Jr. in cash. I don't think the 6 starting spot differential between the two of them. So Dale Jr. starts 28th and Clint Bowyer starts 20th. The 8th spot is super significant because if either of them wreck, you're going to be in bad shape. You're going to be in a little less bad shape if Dale Jr. wrecks because he starts further back and because more people will own him. But let's say he does, then Clint Bowyer is going to be the guy that if he does fine, that'll be a huge leverage in cash games. You'll probably win 80% or more of your cash games. So an argument can be made. I still think Dale Jr. is the better optimal cash game play. I'm just using one of my 3 lineups basically for portfolio purposes. Even though I'm underweight on him, I think in the field, I still have a very high exposure to Dale Jr. and GPPs. So he's somebody I'm trying to get a little bit off of in cash just because I want to hedge a little bit. So I have him in one of my 3 cash game lineups. But I don't think it comes down to a decision between Dale Jr. and Clint Bowyer. Just make your best cash game roster possible. And in that case, I would think if you're just playing one, I would play Dale Jr. Yes, I would take Dale Jr. over Clint Bowyer. But again, there's some theory cases to be made for Clint Bowyer over Dale Jr. as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, someone's asking, sticking with Dale Jr., and this is for GPPs. So what are your thoughts on me having 15% of Dale in GPPs?
15% of Dale and GPPs. That's definitely a high risk maneuver, and I kind of like it. So, I am of the high risk person mold. So I think that's a pretty bold decision there, Cotton, and I think it could work out. So. I like it. I mean, I personally like it. I think it's high risk. Dale Jr. could end up in the winning lineup, and you could be looking at 85% of your lineups not in bad shape, obviously, because you can still have cashing lineups without Dale Jr., but you just won't have a GPP winning lineup if he's obviously in the winning lineup. So I think, like I said, pick one of the 3 and go underweight on him. If you want to go 15% on Dale Jr., that's fine. Just know that it's a high-risk move to do that. So I'm not going 15%. I'm going more than that. I'm underweight on Dale, but I'm not going to be extremely underweight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is from Stevie of Roto Grinders. Can you make the race start earlier? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, if they were calling for rain later in the forecast, they might start at about 10 minutes early. No, I'm just kidding. No rain in the forecast today, so that'll be nice.
Is it a good contrarian play to use Truex in one of 3 max?
It is probably not. I think in a 3 max. I think the optimal percentage on Truex is 3 to 5, maybe up to 8%. So then you're at minimum 25% overweight on him. Because if you're one of 3, that's 33%. I think that's probably not the best move. I think he probably will be lower owned in 3 max than he will in the Beast, the big GPP where people have mass multi-entry and you get a lot more casual players. So he could be lower owned in those, which I think would be in that 5 to 8%. So yeah, if you want to play him, just know that you're probably throwing away that lineup. But hey, if he somehow hits, you're going to be one of a few that ends up with him. And still the problem there is it's not like it's a qualifier where only first place pays. You still aren't guaranteed to even win the GPP if, let's say, it's a 100-person 3 max and you're one of 8 people with Martin Truex Jr. You'll probably cash, but you might not win the GPP, which I guess is okay because it's not a qualifier, and so you'll be in good shape. But I think it's just pretty overweight on him. I think it's, like I said, it's probably no more than 8% chance he's in the winning lineup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so someone's asking a question about the 4 Hendrick drivers, and I think this kind of gets a little bit to the using multiple cash game lineups. But someone's asking, is diversifying in cash games away from all 4 of those drivers a way to get an edge on the field?
I don't know if it's a way to get an edge. It's definitely a way to be different from the field. And like I said, if you add in Jimmie Johnson to this, what's the probability that all 4 of them are in a air quote winning lineup? Now, obviously, we're talking cash, but what's the probability that all 4 of them are in the winning lineup? It's very low. So most likely something will happen to one of these drivers that will prevent them from being in a GPP winning lineup or more drivers. And that means it applies to cash as well. If something is likely to happen to one of these drivers, I think if you make 3 lineups, for example, like I'm doing, and pick and choose one of these each to not have in one of those 3 lineups, maybe you get away from Jimmie in one, maybe you get away from Dale in one, and either Chase or Casey in one, then I think you'll get not an edge on the field, but you'll be different from the field, and you'll kind of be, at worst, you won't be throwing away all your money because you have the same lineup as everybody else and not getting really any benefit from that. So I think there is some merit to being a little bit different this week from the rest of the field, because obviously with Casey, Dale, and Chase, those are like really three really obvious cash game plays. And so if everybody has those, it's going to be a lot harder for you to gain a not an edge, but a differentiation on the field, because you've already locked in three of the drivers that everybody else is going to have. And then it's really down to a 3 versus 3 for the rest of your cash game lineup. And if you include Jimmie in that, then a 2 versus 2. So, and that at that point, when it's a 2 versus 2, it's really hard to make a bunch of different lineups, because you probably only have maybe 2 or 3 different combinations of 2 drivers you want to use. So you're really pigeonholing yourself into a bunch of lineups that everybody else is going to have. So I think it does make sense to differentiate, not to get an edge, but to give yourself a chance of beating a lot of the field in at least one of your cash game lineups, if not 2.
Mm-hmm. All right, someone's asking about Kevin Harvick, who's starting 12th. They're saying that he's the earliest qualified driver in a potential lineup. And I don't know if they're asking this for cash or GPPs, but is this too risky to give up early dominator points?
It's not too risky. I definitely have some lineups where Harvick is my only air quote dominator, because I think he can get to the front pretty quickly. And then if we get an early caution, he could dominate a portion of the race. And coming from 12th starting position, even if he finishes 4th and gets a handful of laps led and fastest laps, he will definitely be in the winning lineup. So that 8th place differential is going to be huge, rather than a -4 or 5 place differential if you're like Kyle Busch, for example. So I don't think it's actually impossible to have a lineup where you fade completely the top 8, 10 drivers. Certainly you want to have exposure to some of them. Obviously Kyle Busch, we mentioned. You could have exposure to Kenseth if you want, or Kurt Busch, Brad Keselowski, Kyle Larson, Joey Logano. So there's a lot of drivers in that top 10 that you can have exposure to. I also think it's certainly possible that a winning lineup could have like Harvick, Jimmie Johnson, and then some of those medium price drivers starting in the back as well if they come forward, if things shake up, and if Harvick ends up being like the only dominator, for example. So no, not a bad roster construction, but I certainly wouldn't, if you have multiple entries, it certainly wouldn't make that your only roster construction.
Mm-hmm. All right, so David Reagan qualified 31st. Someone is asking, how much is too much, and should the person consider pivoting to Landon Castle, who showed more practice speed relative to starting position?
Yeah, I like Castle better than Reagan this week. Castle did show more speed. He's $200 more expensive, which I think makes it harder. But I think it's okay, because it's pretty easy to make lineups this week, given the way qualifying happened, given the way nobody's priced over 10,300, and given the way that we want to typically make balanced lineups this week. So I think too much Reagan is probably over 10%, because I think a balanced lineup will make a lot more sense. I have some numbers here on practice. Chris Buescher was the last driver in practice to be within a second of the leader in final practice, which was Kyle Busch, who was the fastest in final practice. And then everybody after that was like almost a half second slower than Buescher. And that's where we talk about this separation of speed. These smaller teams just don't have the speed at these huge tracks, because they don't make the horsepower. They don't quite have the mechanical and aerodynamic grip and downforce that you want. So it's going to be very hard for these teams starting 30th or worse. They also all practiced 30th or worse. So that really shows that not only did they qualify poorly, but they also practiced poorly. There's a lot of separation of speed this week. So I think too much David Reagan would be anything over 10%, and I'd rather have Landon Castle than David Reagan for the reasons mentioned. He starts 3 spots further back and was a little bit faster in final practice. So, give me Landon Castle.
Mm-hmm. All right, so sticking with David Reagan, who do you like in cash? Hamlin and David Reagan, or the Dillon brothers?
Dillon brothers, easy. I don't think you want to play Reagan in cash, given the fact that there's so much separation of speed. The only way they move forward is through DNFs or some really wonky pit strategy. We're not going to get rain strategy, so not like Chris Buescher last year. So I would much rather have a balanced approach with the Dillon brothers.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is more of a meta question. Someone is asking if you can start putting what statistics are factored into the model in the weekly article, because this person doesn't always listen to the podcast.
That's a good question. I think we can definitely start doing that going forward. I will put which which factors go into finishing position. I might not do it for laps led and fastest laps because those are less reliable anyway, because we get R squareds around 0.5 and up in finishing position. For fastest laps, it's usually around 0.4, and then for laps led, it's anywhere from 0.2 to 0.3 most weeks. So usually the tops is like 0.33 on fastest, or on laps led, I should say. So I think for finishing position, we can definitely put that in the model section there.
Boom. We're just improving the product.
There we go. Great suggestion, actually.
In real time.
Yeah.
So someone's asking, can you share who you think is going to win today? Your two picks to win. Top two picks.
I'm going to go with... damn, this is tough. I'm going to go with Kevin Harvick. He's never won here before, but I just have a feeling about him this week, and Brad Keselowski. I think those two will be the two fastest cars. Kyle Larson, I think, could be right there, and Kyle Busch could be right there. I just think Harvick was pretty happy with his car, and when he's happy with his car, he's tough to beat. I know Kyle Busch was the fastest in practice, in terms of single lap average, and definitely is quick this week, but strategy can always shake things up. He is kind of probably pissed off after the last 2 weeks of what's happened, so there's merit to, I think, both Kyles, Brad Keselowski, and Harvick, but I'm going to go with Harvick then Keselowski.
Mm-hmm. All right, someone says that he's just trying to throw away $33. So do you have any thoughts on a risky qualifier play and then a risky qualify fade?
There's 3 drivers I like in qualifiers. I think they all kind of start a little bit further forward, and they're also cheaper priced. So if they kind of just finish ahead of where they started, you'll be in good shape with them because this is a place differential combined with finishing position week, and they provide a bit of salary. So those 3 drivers are Ryan Newman starts 10th, Paul Menard starts 13th, and Eric Jones, who starts 15th. I think all 3 of those are going to be relatively low owned. My model has all 3 of them about 10% or less. So those are great qualifier plays because I think one of the 3 could end up in the winning lineup. I wouldn't play all 3 of them, so I'd pick one. And then a good qualifying fade would probably be Kyle Busch. I think he might be too high owned in qualifiers. People still like that safety of that front first starting spot, so I think he could be too highly owned relative to the probabilities in the winning lineup.
Mm-hmm. So you talked, I think, a little bit about Larson and whether he would win or lose, but someone's asking just big picture, what are your thoughts on Larson?
You realize most of the drivers are losers every week, right?
Yeah. They're all losers.
Yeah, exactly. No, Kyle Larson is a good play. He was fast in practice. He kind of messed up his qualifying lap a little bit there, but he was super fast in qualifying. He's been fast all weekend. That combined practice number that I talk about, which is averaging the 2 practice sessions, he's right up there in the top 2. So certainly tough to fade him this week. He starts 7th. He could come forward and finish 2nd or 3rd and lead a handful of laps. He could definitely be in the winning lineup. So I will have a decent amount of exposure to Kyle Larson. He's one of my favorite plays this week of those drivers starting inside the top 10 right there.
Someone's asking about full-on fades for GPP other than Truex.
I think Jamie McMurray's a pretty much lock fade. He's starting 8th, and he's never finished better than 7th at Pocono. He wasn't super fast in final practice. Let me flip over to the practice sheet here. Jamie McMurray practiced 19th in the single lap in final practice, and even in the combined, if you average 2 practice sessions, which, like I said, I think makes sense this week, even though first practice was before qualifying because of the separation of speed, that at starting position highly correlates with practice at Pocono. He was 14th in the combined, so not super fast. He seems better in qualifying trim than in race trim, so Jamie McMurray is a nice full fade this week.
Okay. Who are you overweight on compared to the field in GPP? I mean, give us one. Give us just one.
It's my answer here is going to be the only female on the field, Danica Patrick.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you give any indication of what range of starting positions we should be focusing on?
I think, like I said, we want to go mostly balanced this week. So anybody, obviously 29th or forward, and then kind of decreasing a little bit as you get towards the front. So I mentioned fading McMurray. Truex is mostly, if not a complete fade. Kenseth Blaney, for example, are tough to play. So really, I guess, focusing from like 29th to about maybe 5th or 6th, where that Keselowski, Kurt Busch cutoff is, and then also throwing in some Kyle Busch, of course. So I think those are the starting positions you really want to focus on this week.
So you just mentioned there Keslowski. Someone was asking what your thoughts are on him for cash games.
Not for cash. Too far forward for cash games. I think you can get much better value with Harvick, who's cheaper, starts 6 spots further back. You don't even have to use Harvick in cash, obviously, because you go another 6 spots back, and there's Denny Hamlin in 18th and Jimmie Johnson in 19th. And both of those are fine cash game plays as well. Denny Hamlin being even more of a discount at 8,900 and also having one of the best track histories here. And track type history is one of the most important stats this weekend. Great flat track racer. So I definitely think I'd much prefer Denny Hamlin or Jimmie Johnson or even Kevin Harvick to Brad Keselowski in cash.
Someone's asking, where do you get average green flag speed numbers?
I don't even use those, so I couldn't tell you.
That's good. Okay. Is Landon Castle the best sub $6,000 play, or is there another cheap option you'd recommend for GPPs?
Yeah, I think he's the best sub $6,000 play. He's the one I have the most exposure to. We did talk about David Reagan, certainly usable. I think, Matt DiBenedetto is usable. Don't love it. And I think Corey LaJoie is usable. Also don't love it. But, he's min salary. So if you want to go with like a balanced 5, like a really expensive balanced 5, and then just throw in Corey LaJoie, I think that's possible.
So on the podcast, you mentioned that in some ways Pocono is comparable to the courses, like the road courses, just because of like it's unpredictable and flat. And so, anyway, it's similar in a way to IndyCar racing, like because you've mentioned before that IndyCar racers tend to be better at road courses. So the question: do former IndyCar drivers have an edge on flat tracks?
I wouldn't say a huge edge, maybe a little bit relative to what they normally perform. So like AJ Allmendinger, probably better at Pocono than the average track for him. I don't think there's any other former IndyCar drivers in the field. Maybe Michael McDowell, I think, ran one IndyCar race at one point in time. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. So really, we're only looking at AJ Allmendinger in this case. Obviously, we used to have a few former IndyCar drivers, Sam Hornish Jr., Juan Montoya. So,
is it Danica, or did I make that
Danica,
up?
that's true. Danica, I did forget about that. Danica definitely. I think this is not one of her best tracks, but I think relative to average, it's probably slightly better. And I think part of that also is the fact that she's a Stewart Haas racing car, so they make a ton of horsepower as well. She's on a strong team, and here is really definitely a team oriented track. Not like stacking teams, but just like there's a handful of teams that are going to be really good here. So I think Danica is not lucky, but advantaged from that standpoint as well. But I wouldn't say it's a huge edge. I think there's more edge on the road courses and also a track like Martinsville. Danica is actually really good at Martinsville. So is AJ Allmendinger because of all the braking technique. There's less so at Pocono where the corners are a lot more long and wide and sweeping. So there's still some road course. It is the oval that drives like a road course, but I think it's more so at even some of the other flat tracks like Martinsville.
All right, someone's asking about single dominator lineup, and I don't know if this is cash or GPP, so maybe address both. But out of Larson, Keselowski, and Harvick, if you had to do one dominator, which one would you be going with?
I think for me, I'm going slightly more Harvick than Keselowski because I also am building in a little bit of place differential there. But by the fact that I only have a tiny bit more Harvick than Keselowski means I actually think I like Keselowski to dominate better. I'm just also adding in some of the place differential factor for Harvick there. So I think just in terms of dominating, Keselowski would be my number one pick of those three.
So you mentioned Almendinger as a IndyCar driver, former IndyCar driver. Someone's asking, what are your thoughts on Almendinger versus Ty Dillon in relation to each other in cash games and tourneys?
Yeah, so they're priced 6,900 and 6,800. I think Almendinger has just had a lot better speed this weekend. Ty Dillon hasn't quite shown as much speed as Almendinger. They're not like hugely different, and I think in the race some of that could be negated by if your car kind of for whatever reason doesn't set up quite as well during the race at later portions of the race. So I like Almendinger better just because I think he's in a better car right now and a better driver at Pocono. But I don't think it's a huge difference between the two. So in terms of cash games, super close because Ty Dillon also has that 6-spot safety in place differential. So I think just in terms of practice versus qualifying, I give a slight nod to Ty Dillon. I just don't think he has as much high finishing position potential as AJ Allmendinger does.
Mm-hmm. All right, I really like this next question, and I tend to like questions like this. Someone's asking about pit locations, and then they're also randomly asking about Chris Buescher, but really talk about pit locations.
So this week, pit stalls are not going to be as big of a deal as they were last week at Dover, for example, where Matt Kenseth got that pit stall penalty and got sandwiched between Jimmie Johnson and Jamie McMurray in a really tight pit box. This week, much wider pit boxes at Pocono because it's one of the biggest tracks, also longer, I should say. And so I'm not too worried about pit stall selection. Obviously, Kyle Busch being the pole sitter has an advantageous pit box, but Kyle Busch also did lose his crew chief this week because of that penalty for the tire falling off. But that's a kind of a different thing there. So that said, I'm not too worried about pit stall selection this week. I think it's going to be mostly a non-issue.
Mm-hmm. All right. So someone's saying that we've spoken a lot about differentiating. Give us 2 mid-range drivers that can get us away from the rest of the field.
2 mid-range drivers that can differentiate us?
Yeah.
So I did talk about, Ryan Newman right there as a qualifier play. I don't mind him in GPPs. I wouldn't have a ton of exposure, obviously, because he starts up there in 10th, and that's really right around the border of where you want to be playing guys like that. Eric Jones, I mentioned, again, differentiate. And I guess if I'm going to throw one more, it's not super differentiating in terms of like what the projected ownership percentage is, but Austin Dillon right there in 17th. He's qualified 17th. He's got a top 14 driver rating at Pocono over the last 2 years in incident-free races. So, my model projects him right around 20%, but I think there's maybe a bit better than 20% chance of him being in the winning lineup. So Austin Dillon I like as a GPP play as well.
All right, so someone is asking, when you're making lineups in an optimizer, how many unique players should I have in each build?
What do you mean in each build?
I guess like each time you're making a new sort of like optimal lineup with an optimizer, how many unique drivers should you have in each one?
Compared to your previous lineups, I guess?
Yeah, I guess that's the question.
I was going to say, you should have 6 drivers in every lineup. No. I guess it really depends on how risk tolerant you are, because if you have a much tighter core of drivers, let's say you make 10 lineups and you keep a really tight core, there's one driver you have in all 10 lineups or whatever, and a couple you have in like 8 or 9 of them. If they don't hit, you're going to be in big trouble. So really risk tolerant dependent question there. I like having decently tight cores. I would say this week is probably one of my more spread out ones because it is a place differential week and because there can be some randomness at Pocono. In other weeks, I will go with a much tighter core. So, let's say you're making 10 lineups. I think a good number of drivers to have in that would be in the 12 to 15 driver range.
Mm-hmm. All right. Someone's saying, I keep on ending up with cash on the table in cash game lineups. Is that okay?
Yep. I think that's fine. Even in cash games, I wouldn't end up with a ton. Like, I don't have any cash game lineups, I think, I make 3 this week, as I said. I don't have any that are over $300 left on the table. That's not to say you can't go 400, 500, 600, but I probably, once you get around that, I would start to consider maybe restructuring a little bit.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on Stenhouse as a GPP play? Starts 23rd, 7,200. His track history isn't good, but he's had a good or fast car all year.
Yeah, he's had a fast car all year, but this week he hasn't really had a fast car in practice per se. Didn't qualify very well, and again, this is one of the weeks where qualifying and practice times correlate. So if you look at a single lap practice speed in final practice, it's 23. His combined practice is 28. Qualified 23rd. Not a huge amount of upside, but obviously things can shake up at Pocono, so I don't mind some exposure to him. My model projects him around 7 to 8% ownership. 8% almost exactly. So I think being right around there is okay. If you want to go a little overweight on him, that's not a problem. Obviously, you want to get leverage on some of these guys. And if we're completely fading drivers like, for example, Truex or Jamie McMurray, who some percentage of that field will have exposure to those drivers, that leaves you a little room to go overweight on a few drivers. So I don't mind a few percentage overweightness on Ricky Stenhouse. Just don't expect a ton out of him today.
All right, so someone actually did ask a question about Trevor Bane, which means we were near the end of the show. Bane versus Stenhouse in GPPs.
Bane. I will pick Bane over Stenhouse. A little bit faster this week. And I think he's going to be maybe just a touch lower owned, maybe. My model gives a shade lower owned. He is $2,000 discount though, but he starts one spot ahead of Ricky Stenhouse. In terms of practice, he was one spot slower than Ricky Stenhouse in final practice, but 2 spots better in the combined practice type deal. So I think those two cars are just neck and neck with each other. I just, for whatever reason, like Bane, because I think maybe a touch more will be on Ricky Stenhouse, given how the two have performed this year. We saw somebody mention Ricky Stenhouse has been good this year, so I think that kind of would lean people towards Stenhouse. So that makes me lean towards Bane on a ownership percentage play right there.
Someone's asking, so when you say you're looking at a practice sheet, what practice sheet are you looking at? Is this on the website or on some other sites?
Yeah, no, it's just you can find it on almost any fantasy NASCAR or NASCAR site. Like you just go to NASCAR.com, you can look up the practice times from final practice, for example. You could go to it used to be jski.com. Now jski's moved over to ESPN, but if you go to the jski section of the NASCAR site at ESPN.com, you can find it there. Several different places to find practice times. So that's where I always head is NASCAR.com or ESPN.com and just pull it from JSki.
Mm-hmm. All right, final question here. So you mentioned Danica in GPPs. What are your thoughts on Danica in cash?
She's not the worst play in cash by any means. 6,100 starting there in 24th. She actually practiced faster than 24th there. So she practiced 22nd in final practice and has 21st combined average over the 2 practice sessions. So definitely usable in cash, especially if you want to go with a lineup that has like Jimmie Johnson and Chase Elliott, and then maybe something like Kevin Harvick as well. So a viable roster construction. I don't have Danica in cash, but that's because I have a lot of her in GPPs, so I'm kind of hedging and not using her in cash, but viable in cash games for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, actually, so that's the last Twitter question. I have a question here. So you've mentioned a couple of times the kind of macro portfolio perspective of you have someone, you're heavier on them in GPP, so you're going a little underweight in cash. Can you talk, I guess, sort of just big picture about like what the percentages are when you tend to be like, okay, where's the threshold when it's like, all right, this is too much for GPP, so I need to scale back in cash?
It's week to week dependent because I'm super heavy on Chase Elliott this week, and I have him in all 3 of my cash game lineups as well. So that part of that also just comes to who do you really like, and I really like Chase this week. Whereas like Dale Jr. and Casey Kane and are good plays, they're very good plays. So I'm going to use a lot of them in GPP. But I don't think they're like the best plays. They're not like Chase Elliott. Like I feel like Chase Elliott's the nuts outside of like problems. So that's where I want to hedge on those 2 drivers in cash games. Now, it turns out I did use Kane in all 3, but just because it made sense with salaries and stuff. But that's kind of where I get to the point where I'm like, okay, 40, 50% ownership, and I don't love them. Then I might start thinking about hedging off of them in GPPs or off of them from my GPP exposure by not using them in as many cash game lineups.
Right. All right. Nick, final thoughts here.
I think just Pocono's wild, man. So I'm going to actually, this is something I wanted to say. I'm looking at my ownership percentages from my exposures, I should say. And if I combine everybody that I have inside the top 11, including Michael McDowell on 11th, who I think is a complete fade this week, my combined ownership percentage of drivers starting inside the top 11 is only 116%. So really, I'm averaging just over one of these drivers per lineup of drivers starting inside the top 11. So that kind of tells you my thoughts on what this week is going to be. But then if I also, because somebody asked about that question about what starting positions, and I said 29th to up there in that Keslowski Harvick range or whatever, that Keslowski Busch range, Kurt Busch. Then if we look at drivers starting 30th or worse, my exposure, I have a combined 26.7%. So that really tells you I'm going with this balanced approach this week. Drivers starting 29th or better and kind of scaling it down as I go forward in the field. It's like a restrictor plate light version almost this week, where I'm not using the guys starting in the 30s much, but I am using a lot of the guys in that deep half of the 20s and mid 20s and even in the teens and a little bit more up, in the, I like the dominators inside the top 10, the guys who have dominator potential inside the top 10.
Yeah, so we're about like 55 minutes into the show, and that's probably the most insightful thing you said all show. Not like I'm insulting you, but like that's really valuable information to have an idea of how those ownership percentages break down. Like that's very significant information. Yeah,
it just kind of popped in my head there. But I noticed it, I guess, last night while I was making I kind of want to talk about my process a little bit, and it's really cool because I got to hang out with BD Holla last week he was in town for the World Series of Poker, and we talked a little bit just about our processes, and ours are very similar. We both kind of look at what we think the ownership percentages will be, and then obviously I build a model to predict that, and then we both kind of write down what we want our exposures to be for each driver. So that's what I do. And when I wrote down my want, I realized all these drivers 30th and back, I didn't want much of at all. So I tallied it up, and it's only about, like I said, between 25 and 30% total. So that means I only have a driver starting 30th or worse. Let's say it's 30% in 1 out of every 2 lineups. So, sorry, that's not right. 30 divided by 600. 1 out of every 20 lineups, I should say. I have a driver starting, 30th or worse. So it's not a ton of exposure to them, right? I have 150 lineups because I max enter, and so I have just over 30 lineups of them or something. So not a ton of exposure to them.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, I thought that was an awesome show. Good stuff as always. Best of luck to you in your GPP endeavors and to the listeners. And we will catch you guys next week. That's going to do it for this NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter @RotoDoc, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.